I call this meeting, the Finance Committee, to order at 10:31 a.m. on October 2nd. First of all, let's have our roll call. Alderman Finlayson.
Present.
Alderwoman O'Neill.
Present.
And Alderman Huntley, present. And then moving on, we'll go to our approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes to the agenda that they would like to submit?
Madam Chair, I'll move approval of the agenda as written.
I will second. All those in favor of approving the agenda as written, say aye.
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 Aye. Beautiful. All right, moving on to approval of our minutes from our last meeting. Does anyone have any changes they would like to request to the minutes from our meeting on September 18th?
No. I'll make a motion to move 9/18/24 meeting minutes.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Beautiful. Already on to our legislation. First up, we have 011-24, the Tenant Displacement Fund. And this is for the purpose of establishing a fund for providing assistance to tenants who are displaced when rental units are deemed unfit for human habitation by the city. Just as a reminder, we voted on to send this to committee. Gosh, I guess it was a week and a half ago now, at our last full city council meeting. And I suppose we'll open the floor for any discussion on it.
Madam Chair, would you reiterate, what action did we take on this in council meeting?
We approved it on first reader, if I remember correctly.
Postponed this because Dewan wanted to have a special meeting in between the last housing meeting and the next council meeting, but it never happened. So it's been postponed because it was supposed to go back to housing.
You can speak on the mic so that we can hear the explanation,
Okay.
so that everyone can hear.
It was postponed in housing because we were supposed to have a special housing meeting, and it didn't happen in between here and
Yes.
the last council meeting. So it's still postponed because the one wanted to come, Alderman Gay wanted to come back to housing.
So that won't stop the Finance Committee from acting on it.
No,
Right.
you all can act on it.
Okay.
And then it'll be ready for his committee.
Excellent. Does anybody have any further comments, questions on this?
Well, I guess I have a question for Ms. Dickinson. Is this funding that was state generated or city generated?
Finance Director Jody Dickinson. There has been no funding set aside for this. There's nothing from the state or federal or the city. This is the establishment of a fund for that purpose, and that it would be, I guess the idea that in the future it would be funded with sources, including city and any other sources they're seeking for the fund.
Okay, I thought I recalled that Alderman Gay was pursuing state funding.
It may be true, and that part I don't know about. This is just the establishment of the fund.
Okay, in a brief aside, just as I was driving in, I was thinking that we should have a mechanism so that when folks go to the state to request funds, we should know about it, not after the fact, which is pretty much how we learn about certain things. But that doesn't require, I'm just making a statement. There are items that come, that our colleagues or others in the community pursue funding from the state, and then we find out about it after the fact. I didn't know whether this was that specific incident, but clearly it's not. Okay, so that whole thing is something else we have to address, but this is not the time.
Yeah, I'll just say my opinion on this is I see no reason not to establish the fund. I think when it comes time to potentially capitalize the fund, we can determine if it is the highest and best use of our city tax dollars. But creating it seems like nothing to be opposed to.
I concur.
And I'll say this, a situation had come up this summer with one of my constituents where their rental unit was unlivable because of a flood from the unit above them. Going to the property manager, that particular resident wasn't given any options for alternate housing because that resident was told that they didn't have renter's insurance and therefore not eligible for housing. So the city came in and paid for housing for the resident for 3 nights. But it was a huge ordeal because they're also in public housing, and they were trying to go through the system. Like, is there a clause in their contract that says that they're not eligible for other places? It's just been a really long process. This would be helpful in that, but there's some more detail that needs to be, as the staff report says, that needs to be worked out because how long the city was able to do it for 3 days after sending the resident to the crisis hotline first. The crisis hotline was able to help them for 2 days and the city helped them for 3 additional days. So there's a lot more to it than just offering. And do we pay for food, which I know is brought up in the staff report. Transportation, that particular resident ended up not staying in the hotel that was allocated to that resident because they didn't have transportation to that hotel. And their job happens to be downtown. So there's a lot of intricacies that we do need to work through, and the funding will be important to detail.
Alderwoman O'Neill, is it your sense that the committee would be best served by trying to work those out as part of the legislation? Or I think the staff report talks about allowing the Office of Community Services to figure it out. Do you have an opinion on that?
I mean, the Office of Community Services is probably where it should be figured out. But eventually it's going to have to be part of the legislation as to how much the funding is and, and what the criteria for it. If somebody is at as a private tenant versus a public housing tenant, does that come into play? Who is the first layer that they need to go through? There's other residents that have talked about, needing funding for rent, but can't pay rent. And they don't actually get funding until the eviction process starts. So there's a lot of intricacies that I think, but Office of Community Services would be the place where I would have the professionals there.
Alderwoman Finlayson?
I'm pretty torn on this. While I understand there's a need and one that I think we should assist with, I'm hesitant about putting us in the middle of something, as Alderwoman O'Neill has said, in which the details have not been yet worked out. I am even more concerned about putting this in the Office of Community Services when they have no capacity to handle one more thing. And so until we can figure out how this can work, where it's gonna go, who's gonna manage it, and not insignificant is the responsibility of the owner, whether it's HACA or somebody else. We should maybe require in all rental agreements that they require a rental license, not a rental license, rental insurance. If that's the pivot that will allow them to get assistance, then they need to require it of everybody, or include it in their agreements. I don't know what the best approach is, but this is much larger than what's being presented to us. And I'll ask Ms. Dickinson, by creating this fund, does it obligate us to fund it? And I know the answer to that, but you know what I mean. Philosophically, should we have the funds to put in it if we're gonna create the fund?
I probably, from a procedural standpoint, I wouldn't even establish the fund until I had, from an accounting standpoint, wouldn't establish it until I had funds to go in it. But I do think it's important to work out details about how we would do this, because I have some other concerns about the way that the legislation is written regarding interest being posted to the fund and things like that, that we weren't a part of the drafting of it. So, you know, those types of terms, and I know Assistant City Manager has some issues with the details on how they would manage it.
Thank you. And your initial statement was what I was looking for. We shouldn't create a fund.
Well,
By your professional advice, until we've got,
What I would say is there's two steps: creating the fund from a legal standpoint, and then me creating a fund in the accounting system. I wouldn't do that second step until we had money to put in it. But whether or not you decide to set up a fund with all the details worked out before there's funding for it, that's up to the council. But we have had historical situations where funds were established and no funds were ever put in there. And then suddenly everybody's wondering, where's the fund? Where's the fund? Where's the fund? Because no funding was ever allocated to it.
thank you. May I call, Mr. Chair, on Ms. Buckland?
Go ahead.
To give us her professional thoughts. I don't
Yeah,
want
I
to say
just-
opinion, I wanted more professional than that, but.
Yeah, I wanted to just, echo some comments that both Alderwoman O'Neill and you, Alderwoman Finlayson, made. There are a lot of, from my perspective, sort of fundamental policy questions, some of, which are in the staff report that I would think council would have a view on, right? That isn't just up to the Office of Community Services, that question of like, well, so why was the unit condemned? I would think that would make a difference in what we're supporting. Questions about how long do we support, wraparound services, what are our obligations to find units? You had experience with someone who was like, I kind of really want to be in a particular place. But we know that housing is tough, and it is one of the fundamental issues that anyone who deals with housing and homelessness deals with, is just there's not a lot of options out there. And I would think that you guys would have opinions about that. And my hope would be that you would would help craft that from that policy perspective, to really make sure all of us are kind of going in with our eyes open.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I would move that we postpone action
I'll second
and
that.
give the Housing Committee an opportunity to amend this to fill in all the blanks.
Yeah. Yes, all those in favor of that say aye.
Aye.
All right, let's move on. Next up, we have O1224, Maritime Industry Economic Development Fund. Do I hear a motion? Or let's just, I'll open the floor for discussion on O1224.
Mr. Chair, I would ask Ms. Dickinson a similar question. And that would be, we're creating this fund, is there, and I didn't look at the fiscal impact note, it's no direct fund. So here we are again, creating a fund with no funds.
I will say on this one, there was a permit fee paid by somebody who wanted to use the provisions of this fund that was, the program was actually established a couple of years ago by council, and within the last few months, somebody has had to pay that fee to go into the fund. But this provision in the code to actually establish the fund had never been done properly, and that's one of the reasons why we're bringing this to you to set up the fund. There is one source that needs to be deposited into the fund.
So that's not funds generated from our budget, that's from a fine?
Correct.
A fee.
Yeah, a fee, or, I'm not sure it's a fee or a fine, but somebody has had to pay that cost. And now we don't really have a place to put it because legally we have no maritime fund for the fee.
So would then this encourage us to put additional revenue in this account?
You have no obligation to do so. It's just the fee that's supposed to be deposited there. And the council would engage in any discussion to add additional funding.
So what would happen to the monies that's in that account?
The program designates those monies for a particular purpose. I can't recite it to you off the top of my head. It's got to do with maritime issues. And there may even be a committee or a board or a commission that's set up to help decide how to do that, how to manage that program.
Okay, so it just doesn't go to the general fund, there's specific opportunities for
If
the
you
use
pass
of the
this,
funds.
it requires a separate fund, and since there's money to set aside, the finance office has to create a separate accounting fund to track it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further discussion on this or questions of our city staff? As I understand it, this is creating a fund so that we can put fees that we're required to put aside already. So makes a lot of sense to just actually create the fund so we have somewhere to put those.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion that we give a favorable recommendation to 01224.
I'll second it. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Beautiful.
Was there any opposition?
No, I think all three of us.
Oh, okay.
All right, moving on along to 01624 for the purpose of changing when special residential parking district permits need to be renewed. And since we have our sponsor right here, I'll say, Alderman O'Neill, you want to kick us off and just explain what this is and why we ought to vote for it?
Sure. So up until this legislation passes, all of the residential, special residential parking district permits are renewed July 1. And if you come in, say you sign a lease in September for a rental unit in one of those parking districts, and you buy a permit, you get it prorated, but then you're buying a permit in July. This would allow people to buy a permit in September for September to September, which would be probably the length of their lease, and not have to buy a second entire permit if they were planning on leaving that lease after the year. So it would help our residents, it benefits our residents. It also benefits our current parking contractor because it takes that huge burden of all of the permits, I don't have the exact number, being renewed at the same time over the course of the year. Certainly we'll have many that are being renewed at that, last week of June timeline, just because they're longtime residents or whatnot, but anybody else would have the opportunity to renew or get the permit whenever they moved into the space. College kids coming home who might be home for 6 months could then, get the case. It's a benefit to our constituents.
Yeah, I'll say as someone whose lease renews on August 1st, I would particularly appreciate this. It would save me from having to redo it every 1 month after I buy the permit. My question on this one is, so, we have had issues with our permits actually getting renewed on July 1st, right? And I think the last time that happened, there was sort of a grace period. And so if everybody's getting them renewed at different times, won't it make it harder for us to have that grace period for our residents?
I think that would be a question for the parking contractor. And if they were fully staffed and up to par, you would think that if the majority of the parking is being renewed in that last week of June, first week of July, then they could allow for some leniency.
Yeah.
But that would be up to them, I believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that is, I guess what I'm saying is that is what they have done in the past, is allow that leniency in those first couple weeks of July. But if my permit expires in August, and then I go ahead and I renew it on August 3rd because I'm a few days late, then maybe I don't get that leniency now because they don't know that, oh, just Harry's permit is expiring on August 1.
Right. Well, I would also make sure that the onus is on the parking contractor, that they're giving you sufficient notice that your permit is about to expire. In this day and age, with the technology that we have, I don't see any reason why
Yeah.
that can't be. If you're renewing your auto insurance, you get it a month beforehand.
Yeah,
Or,
you would think, right? Alderman Finlayson, were you going to bring something up?
Well, I have a question, and I don't see anyone from the parking agency here. Is there, oh, Ms. Buckland, can you, is there a problem that is being addressed? I know what Alderwoman O'Neill has outlined for us from a constituent perspective. I would like to know how the management company thinks this would benefit or be a hindrance.
Generally believe that this would be helpful for exactly the same reason that right now that work is very, clumpy in time. You're processing everything all at the same time. So trying to even out that work over time, even that out across the year, does make that processing workload much easier, and gives you, part of what happens right now is because you're trying to do so much in a compressed period of time, you're trying to get through that quickly, and so your ability to have some grace, help the patients to talk someone through a renewal if this is their first time or whatever. That's harder when you're kind of slammed with all the renewals at once. So I think that this is helpful from the staff perspective, from the contractor perspective, having that work a little bit more even out and less clumpy.
And they would have the capacity to handle this throughout the year.
Yeah.
Better.
Well,
Yeah, and certainly, obviously, the operator is under contract to the city. Our expectation is that they would, right? We would hold them to the terms of the contract, which is, you have to abide by the city rules. Our indications are that they would prefer this arrangement. So we're not anticipating problems with them complying with this, but obviously that's part of our oversight role, is to make sure that if there ends up being any issues, that they're addressed and worked through.
Yeah.
and
thank you.
I can actually add to that in that this legislation actually came out of the biweekly parking meeting that Director Moore from Transportation and the two parking contractors, Mitchell, I attend, Ellie had attended. It actually came out of that biweekly meeting, so they're well aware of this change, and it came from the contractors.
Okay, so you said they're well aware, but they
support it.
Okay.
They support it. I can't remember which contractor, whether it was SP Plus or Premium, whose idea it was, but keeping in mind that there are several districts of parking, both for Premium and for SP Plus, and we are getting ready to make some changes to the parking district that includes Clay Street and West Washington Street. And one of those changes is we're increasing the time that the parking district is in effect. And up until now, many of the residents haven't purchased parking passes. So knowing that they're going to, when it goes into effect, hopefully in October, they can get their permits and they can have those permits for the year.
Okay, you're talking about Clay Street and West Washington Street.
Well,
They're part of a parking district that
Yeah.
is directly being affected by the fact that they will now be able to, if this passes, get a year permit.
Be required to now get a year permit.
well, just to be clear, I think we're getting two things mixed here, because those changes you're talking about will be a separate change.
Oh, I understand that.
Okay.
I'm clear on
No,
that.
they're
but this
separate,
is-
but they're part of the population that's going to be affected. And having some changes, there's other districts in West Annapolis, they're talking about making changes to the parking district, the times and the streets involved as well. So all of those coming into play just adds more parking permits for the parking contractors to take care of. And leveling it out throughout the year is what they're asking for.
Well, of course, my flag went up when you mentioned Clay Street. I'm sure you recall just 2 meetings ago when the residents of Clay Street, former and current, shared their feelings about being displaced. And so I can't imagine that they're going to feel warmly now about having to have a permit to park on the very same streets. So I just.
They're actually asking for it, the residents.
Some of them are. Thank you.
Whether we change it for Clay Street or not, I will definitely appreciate not having to buy a permit twice in a year, because that's basically what it feels like. You got to do it, and then 1 month later, I got to go through the whole process again, re-upload my lease, all that. So I like this legislation. I will
Mr.
move.
Chair, I'll make a motion.
Okay, go ahead.
The chair gives the,
Okay.
I move that we give a favorable recommendation.
Thank you,
To
Alderwoman.
01624.
I'll second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, on to our last piece of legislation, purchasing and procurement. 02624. And I'll just say I have been known to kind of nerd out on procurement policy before, so I'm excited to hear about this one and would welcome whoever from the city would like to present on it.
Yep, Mike can join, who's our procurement officer. The initial drafting was a joint effort led by me with input from Mike and Ashley Leonard. So the three of us had worked on that. The staff report for this one is sort of extensive because there's a lot in that legislation, and I wanted to try to make it easier to parse what's actually changing, what is being changed for readability. So hopefully that was helpful in just like working through all of the different changes.
It was.
For the most part, there are three main kinds of changes being made to the code. The most important one of which are changes to the limits for what qualifies as a micro purchase, a small procurement, and then therefore what's the limit for when a formal procurement starts. There are a whole host then of other changes, most of them somewhat technical in nature, that are around clarifying or cleaning. And that third category then is just sheer readability. So I did try in that second category to pull out anything that has even a small but substantive change. It's an actual change to how things are done. And anything that I didn't mention is readability, and there's no actual change to how the code functions. In terms of the changes to the limits, You'll see I had pulled information from some other jurisdictions just to give you a sense of scale of what happens in other jurisdictions. This is a place actually where Mike and I disagreed a little bit. Mike actually would like to see the micro purchase limit higher than what I had ended up recommending. So the reason that it's 10,000 is my comfort level. Mike's actually got a little bit more comfort level than I do. But what I will say is that there are a couple of things that are driving that change. One is just sheer inflation, right? When those levels were set, $3,000 and $25,000 meant something different, right? So there's a certain amount of just general updating. Inflation has particularly hit the construction area. And as you are well aware, and sort of related to that second driver, the city does have a lot going on. The city has made a real commitment to resilience projects, mobility projects, and stuff like that, which are heavily impacted by those increases in the construction costs. And they bring with them their own work volume. So the intention of changing those limits is both to reflect changes in inflation and stuff like that, but then also not to change when we are required to have competition, but to focus the Office of Central Purchasing's time and energy into those larger projects that have more risk, and that the city has a real commitment to getting done, right? And so really trying to maximize their time and energy. Mike, is there anything you want to add into that?
Mike Garasha, procurement officer. Mickey brought some valid points up here, and I think what the issue with the policy, we want to make policy where it's easier for us to be more efficient, not to make things encumber the departments or encumber us. Right now, we've made a lot of procedural changes. I think we're going in the right direction right now. Joey and I, talked when we first met, and there's been a lot of improvements there. Now, there are some things that I have to deal with, and I can't deal with everything we see now. Preferably, I would like to have everything under a contract, but that's not going to be realistic right there. If you're going to go out and, let's say, buy a screw or something, we need to have the departments the ability to go out, and they're custodians of their money right now. And Vicki and I've talked about, okay, what is a good limit, a sweet spot to have a small purchase? Now it's up to them. Now we look at that also when they make these purchases. We say yay or nay on that there. But let's remember, we got to keep the city operating right here. And I've worked with small limits up to 100,000. I worked for government 250,000. But again, let's look at the spend of the city. What's going to encumber the city right now? And I'm okay with 10,000. But again, I've worked with 15,000, and I'm not going to make it issues. I don't either way we go there. I do want to see our small purchase limit go to 100,000. Let me tell you why. Legal has to write a contract for everything over $25,000. This takes time. It takes time on me. I've got to do a contract abstract and send it to Ashley. Now, with a small purchase, please understand, you're required to get 3 bids, a minimum of 3 bids on this, sir. It's not like we're going out there and say, we're going to buy this at our discretion. But there are still rules we have to follow on that there. And we keep records on that there.
Alderwoman Finlayson, I see a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Grassi.
You call him Mike.
I prefer to use your formal title in a formal meeting like this, but thank you, Mike. I'm afraid I didn't catch all of what you were saying because I forgot to put my hearing aids in this morning. So bear with me, please.
Right.
The thing that caught my attention was the fact that we're going from 3,000 to 10,000, but you're advocating for even higher. I heard Ms. Buckland say something to the effect that we have construction that requires considerably higher dollar amounts, and then we have other things supplies or whatever, considerably lower. What I see in the chart is Baltimore City, it varies. Is there a consideration for some sort of a bifurcated process so that there's one amount for certain things like supplies and whatever, and another threshold for construction?
Mike Rossi, Procurement Officer, let me clarify this. With construction, this does not really qualify as a small purchase. You have to basically, you have capital construction, non-capital construction. There's a duration for that project. The policy really does not affect that. When we do a contract for a non-construction, non-capital construction project or a construction project, we have to write a contract because the duration goes past, it may go a year, it may go 2 years on that term. You don't do a small purchase on a major capital project or a non-capital project. If you have, let's say you want to paint this area here, it's construction, but it's basically a goods and services. So you got to basically separate and parse out what's construction, what's goods and services. So, but as Vicki said, there are some escalation costs on that, on construction projects. We address them through change orders, through a contract. So don't mix up construction with small purchases there.
So,
Okay.
and I'll chime in on that. It's an interesting question. And that isn't something that I ended up really thinking about for two reasons. One is part of my goal in this arena, in this round, was to address some of the things that were sort of the most immediate, obvious pain points, but without making kind of fundamental changes to how we approach procurement. We obviously have a new director of central services coming on, and part of what was in my head was allowing that person to be part of that conversation. So I'm not really proposing fundamental changes to how we think about procurement. The second is that I understand the distinction you're making, and that does make some sense to me. I think we would need to be careful about how we define and figure out when you're in one camp and when you're in another. But I think part of what I'm hearing in your question is some discomfort with 100,000. It's trying to find some ways to sort of meet in the middle. But it is a good question.
Well, that leads to my next question, which is, since we have a new director coming on, is there an urgency to do this now, as opposed to letting the new director, with his staff who has the experience in the city, to weigh in together?
From my perspective, yes. This is something that both the administration and actually, council members have commented on, and I know I've heard frustration from multiple council members about a number of projects that feel like they're lingering. And some of that is just truly trying to manage that throughput. Like I said, the city has really made this deep commitment to a number of different improvements. And we want to be able to execute on that in a timely way. And so those limits go a long way to easing that path, to make some things easier to do, and to be able to focus their time. Would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Mike Rossi, Procurement Officer. Now, getting back to your point, we're looking at something called job order contracts right now. Again, I think you're looking, from a small purchase perspective, is $25,000, is not a lot of money. Basically, we need to raise that limit there. Now, I'm talking about when we do these, we still have to get 3 quotes. Anything up $100,000 up, let's say you say $10,000 or small purchase, a micro purchase limit. For 10,001 to 100,000, you still have to get 3 quotes. That's not going to be used in construction. That's going to be used for something. Let's say we need to make a purchase of furniture that's going to be run $30,000. Or we need to buy something to basically some kind of goods and services. When you get into construction, that's a totally different sector right there. Those require contracts. They have to be written.
I'm going to actually add one thing, because you reminded me of something that I didn't say that I should, which is that those limits apply to the purchase, to the contract, which means that those limits often are being applied against multiple years, right? So if you've got a 3-year contract, you're not really talking $25,000 a year, you're talking a little over $8,000 a year, right? So the 100,000, right, that's not 100,000 every single year, right? That's over the life of that intended purchase. And it is one of the reasons why procurement still ends up being part of that discussion, is to make sure that we've chosen the appropriate vehicle given the intended duration of the purchase. If you're going to be doing this again and again for the next 5 years, we need to look at what that value is over a 5-year term, right? So I just want to make sure that that changes that calculus a little bit.
I understand that. Are we in the hiring process for the new director? I'm still not clear on, and I know you said we need to expedite what we have in the pipeline, and I'm totally in support of that. I can't imagine that it's going to take us 4 or 5, 6 months to get a person in place. So, I would just hate for a new director to come in and then have no say over something, fundamental in his or her department.
Yeah, I don't actually think that these limits are likely to be controversial for a new director.
Then I trust that if that is the case, you'll come back with us with an amendment to this portion of the code.
And I would think
with my tail between my legs.
I will echo your comments that I can't imagine a situation in which the director comes in and says, boy, what I really want to do is spend more time stuck in paperwork.
It's a little more complicated.
Well, I know. But at the same time, I'm saying, what's their incentive? Just so I understand, is it possible for them to follow, say they're doing a contract for $20,000, but they want to follow the more restrictive over $100,000 process? That's still allowed, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
it doesn't prohibit you from doing that. And there are times when, if you've got something where you think the city likely has some risk, or you're in a relationship where potentially things might go a little sideways and you want to make abundantly clear, all parties understand, what do we do if this happens? What if we do if that happens? So there are times when we still do write a contract for something that's a lesser amount. And there are a whole host of reasons why you might do that. What this change would mean is that we're not going to force you to do that no matter what your situation looks like. But you always have the option of writing a contract.
Mike Russell, let me clarify about how contracts are. Contracts are 2 different categories. You have what I call a contract purchase agreement, a CPA, and you have what I call a BPA. It's called a blanket purchase agreement. Now, getting back to your point right now, this small purchase is a one-time spot purchase. It is not to be utilized over several, every other year. If we have a long-term, call a BPA, let's say you need $100,000 for over 3 years' time, then you have to do a BPA. And that BPA is basically each year you're allowed to spend, you spend $100,000. So that requires a contract. The small purchase, again, is only a one-time spot purchase. And you're only allowed to make that to that company once in every 9 to 12 months. Now, if they do it again next year, I'll say, no, you're not. You're going to get a contract. If you need a contract with this company to continue to do that, then you get a contract with them. Otherwise, I'm not going to approve this right there. So don't take the impression that just because you have $100,000, we're going to spend $100,000 to the same company every year. That's not going to happen. That's called order splitting. Because
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Ms. Leonard is in the audience if she'd like to add anything to the discussion, since she is in charge of all of our contracts.
I mean, I worked, Ashley Leonard, Assistant City Attorney. I worked closely with procurement and the Assistant City Manager to come up with these changes. I'm not uncomfortable with any of them. I've been doing procurement contracts for about 15 years now. I think our limits are due to increase. The reality of it is, as they both pointed out, is $25,000 does not get you very far anymore. And sometimes it takes way more effort to negotiate a contract, a formal contract, than to just, be able to get 3 quotes and issue a purchase order. And for a lot of stuff, that's perfectly acceptable because our purchase orders do have legally binding language in them. So you're not empty netting it. You're not getting no legal protections if you go the purchase order 3 quote method. You're just streamlining it a little bit. And construction is very different. Construction is not going to come in under $25,000 anymore anyway, the way things are going. So construction is a whole different ballgame. And then there's also things as I was here when we did the original of this code, and it's been about 10 years. And frankly, 10 years is a long time in the world of procurement, and it just needs some updates. It needs some streamlining and some revisions from when we put it through 10 years ago. So I think these are all necessary changes just to make it a smoother process for everyone.
So does it go far enough?
For right now, I'm also of the opinion that we need, since there is going to be a structural shift in how procurement is done and you have a new director coming in, I don't want to go too far. I think these are very solid, needed changes to help the process now. And then I'd like to see what the new director and his or her staff come up with for maybe more innovative thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just also add, I think that the state is really thinking hard about how they might redo procurement code, so all the more reason that we want to make some of these changes now, but not go overboard. I had a couple questions. First, so like I said, I have spent a lot of time thinking about procurement in different contexts, not the city government context, but I think one of the reasons why the state of Maryland tends to be so persnickety, for lack of a better word, about so much of our procurement goes back to Nixon's VP, whose name I'm blanking on for the moment, Spiro Agnew, and that was what he got in trouble for, was bending procurement rules for his buddies. So basically what I'm getting at here is, can you guys just speak a little bit to what risks the city holds in terms of, frankly, malfeasance, and how we can make sure, what are the safeguards that we are keeping on here that, a $99,000 contract is not getting sent in the direction of somebody in particular?
Do you want?
From a legal perspective, it takes a while. You're vetting through multiple different departments. It's the mayor him or herself can't just sign off on anything. You are vetting through the procurement, which will be part of central services. You have to get through finance to actually get the money, processed and out the door. You have to go through the Office of Law for vetting. So, and none of that is being changed by what's in here, is that it still takes a concerted amount of effort and a good number of people, so that even if you agree to the contract, for instance, it's going to kick back at some point. At some point, you're going to be roadblocked by one of the other departments who needs to do something to actively get the money out the door. And so you have multiple people at any stage and for any type of procurement that are going to be looking at it and questioning it. It's not just the one person who's doing it. You have one person by themselves cannot purchase something and get it out the door by themselves. You would need, for lack of a better word, you would need collusion amongst multiple city agencies and departments.
The other thing I'll point out is that the way that process works for anything that falls within that small procurement band, you actually have to submit all 3 quotes that you got.
Right.
So you have to disclose whether you meaningfully reached out to 3 legitimate vendors. You didn't just cherry pick the one you like and then 2 completely random. They couldn't even really do it, right? That all has to be disclosed, and it's part of what procurement looks at and others. So there's that amount of disclosure required.
And I appreciate the addition of the requirement to explain why other bids are rejected. What you were just saying about no one person can buy something by themselves, is that true even for the microtransactions, you would say?
Correct, because even if they charge it, you have someone from procurement and or finance at a minimum who's looking at the money going through. So, this is not like a personal credit card that nobody's going to see the bill. Somebody is going to see the bill at some point. And unless a staff person is going to put their own money into paying it off, somebody else in the city is going to see it.
Got it. So switching gears to another question, it's if a lot of these changes are due to inflation, or that's a lot of the reason for these changes, does it make sense to just peg these numbers to the CPI in the same way we do with wage growth?
Mike Russia, procurement officer, no.
Okay.
That's a different issue right there. What we're doing right now is basically making it less restrictive on the departments to do business. Right now, I've got a stack of things right now that should have been done by the ex-procurement officers I'm dealing with right now. I'm not going to get into that detail right now, but I've got things that right now insurances right now. I've got expired contracts. I've got expired insurance. I don't have time right now to go, look at everything. And as Ashley said, there's a lot of safeguards in there. Now, one thing I do is I save every purchase order we issue out of the city. If I see a duplicate, I'm keeping a record right now. I don't have any history on it right now. If I see basically go with the same vendor every year, this time next year, we're going to have a talk with that person. And I'm going to say, all right, if you're going to be using that, we're going to either get a contract or something. But again, if we raise these limits in there, that's why I'm trying to give a little flexibility. I don't see the abuse right now. I work at the IG up at the Architect of Capital for, on different things like this. And I've seen all the tricks of the trades these amateur criminals are trying to do. And I don't see us here. I think everybody's behaving. But we've got to get, my focus has got to be on other areas right now. And again, Ashley looks, every solicitation we do, every contract, she looks at the solicitation and makes comments on it. And if it doesn't pass her area, I don't put it out there. I'll make the changes as she recommends. She gets, basically, I'll pay her an abstract. She looks at the contracts. She renegotiates with people. Finance looks at the money. I look at the money to make sure. I've had to basically, last year, cancel 2 contracts because there was no money encumbered. I said, we're not issuing contracts, you're the money encumbered. So we do have a lot of safeguards in place, a lot of records we keep.
Yeah,
So
no, Mike.
in terms of the,
Okay.
I'll jump in to, I get where that question is coming from and why you're asking it. The part of what helps any process like this move easily is that people sort of get embedded in their heads what the limits are, so that it becomes easier for people to exercise that decision tree. If I'm in this situation, I'm going this way. If I'm in this situation, I'm going this way. Having those limits change every year sort of breaks that cognitive flow, and I think does make it harder to actually get yourself into trouble because people are less certain. There's just more effort involved in figuring out, okay, for this year, which camp am I in? So I actually wouldn't recommend that just for just sheer efficiency.
That makes total sense. I'm glad you brought it up. It makes me think of okay, it's great to make a more complicated password until you make it so complicated that you got to put it in a sticky note on your computer. Yeah, heard.
Mike, I'll make a comment about the CPI. Now, we are allowed to make modifications to a contract, but before I do that, we basically have to get the data from the U.S. Department of Labor and to see what the CPI is for the commodity is right there. We put in our contracts that you're allowed an increase on your contracts, but it's in accordance with the CPI. And you're only allowed to you got to make that request before the contract, goes on the next contract term right there. Now, if something happens, now when I worked in Richmond, when COVID kicked there, we basically, suppliers said, guys, we're having a hard time getting chemical at your plant right now. Can we get extra money? We allowed that, actually signed by procurement, also by our attorney. But even to grant that increase, there's a lot of paperwork that we have to look at. They got to validate this thing. We have to reconcile that. We just don't go writing blank checks to people like that. But
Sure.
yeah, there's a lot of things in it.
Would you say, broadly speaking, that it's easier for you guys to purchase goods than to purchase services? Is there less, let's just say, paperwork, for lack of a better word?
It's all the same. Anything you purchase through procurement is the same amount of detail, the same amount of scrutiny. I don't care if it's $1 million or buying these right here. We still look at that right there because we do have contracts in place to buy these here. And if somebody goes out and says, okay, I'm going to go and spend $10 on a pen, I'm going to say, I don't think so, guys. I mean, we have contracts in place there, but we do have safeguards and things.
What I will say, though, is that the difference sometimes is actually more on the contract side and how it's written. If you're just talking about goods, it's a little bit easier to say, did I get a thing or did I not get a thing? Services is sometimes a squishier concept, and so sometimes thinking through the logic of the contract and how do I know if I fully got the services I was looking for, that sometimes is different, but not enough that I think it affects any of the timelines. It's just a different kind of thought process.
Sure.
And Ashley, I don't know if you've got a,
I mean, no, I mean, I think goods contracts are easier to enforce and monitor, not necessarily easier on the front end to create, and services contracts are tougher to manage and enforce as you go. So you need different protections, but the front end, when you're actually doing it, doesn't make much difference.
May I follow up?
Go ahead.
So do we monitor those service contracts in the interim?
But the using department does for sure. I'm involved, I and probably procurement are involved when there are issues. So like if it's moving along swimmingly and there are no concerns, then we leave that in the using department or agency's hands. But if there starts to be problems, then we would step back in to assist.
Mike Rossi, procurement officer, the process with that there is basically I do not contact the contractor. If there's a performance issue, it's reported to me, then I report to the Office of Law. And they basically take them there. Anytime the attorneys are involved with something, I back away from it. I do not negotiate the contracts. I tell the people that if you're getting a contract, I will back away from it between you and the Office of Law. And because I don't want to say something, they're going to take out of context and, well, Mike said this, it's got to go in the contract there. But procurement does, to a point, we do get involved if we're asked to.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I will make a recommendation that we give a favorable recommendation to 02624.
I actually have a couple other questions.
And you may. Since you're the chair.
So I want to talk about this open solicitation section. And that's something that I see you guys are talking about is entirely new. It's not something I'm particularly familiar with. Could you just give us some examples of when that would be used?
yeah, you can look at me for that one. That's a procurement method that I'm familiar with from my prior work. So for example, one of the things that has come up recently that no decisions have been made. I understand conversations are still ongoing with council, but on our staff side, we're trying to think through mechanics. There's been some conversations about potential ways to look at the having like a voucher program or something like that to help ease the leaf blower ban. For the sake of argument, right, let's say you wanted to have a program where potentially any retailer, as long as they agree with the terms and agree with the structure and the rules and all that, that any retailer within some defined area could participate in that. Well, an open solicitation is a perfect vehicle for that because I'm not going to artificially limit who can participate. I do want them all to look the same, right? And so at that point, the city would potentially have an interest in having multiple contracts, but you want them all to look the same, I'm not going to artificially limit the number. In my prior work, we had a number of different open solicitations that were, for example, we had an open solicitation that was around hotels, actually. So if you wanted, we wanted to be able to put people as part of homeless services, and this especially hit during COVID, where you were trying to isolate people. We can have contracts with as many hotels, as long as you're willing to accept this rate, right? Like, I'll take all comers who are willing to be in a relationship with us. So it's not a solicitation method that's appropriate for just anything, but there are times when it's a nice method to have available to you, and it just doesn't exist in the city code. Because of my prior work, I noticed that, because that was something we did in fact use. So I had proposed adding it here as an available method. Obviously, we'd still have to go through Office of Law, still have to go through central purchasing, right? But that was the logic of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm glad we can give you some more tools in your toolbox.
Yeah, and I actually used it at a prior employer. I used to work for Baltimore County, and they had it there. So it's not an unknown for me.
And I'll just say I'm also really excited about the clarification on the cooperative purchasing agreement. I think there's probably a lot of opportunities for us to use that. I'm thinking maybe about trying to buy MS4 credits with the county. Anyway, we could get into lots of different ideas, but I'm glad to see that one in there. So yes, at this point, I will second your motion.
And you can discuss it still after it's on the floor legitimately.
All right, so all those in favor of motion to have a favorable recommendation on O2624, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here today, folks. And now we're moving into our general discussion. And the first item on the agenda, I actually need to broach because I believe I caused a bit of a kerfluffle on this one. The Brewer Hill Cemetery State Fund. So there are two, yeah, do we want to pull the pictures up on this one? I think part of the confusion with this is that there were two different pots of state funding for it. One is the stream restoration, and which went to the city, and then there is also the other one, which is going to the Brewer Hill Cemetery Association, and that's for sort of broader restoration, as I understand it. I think at some point some wires got crossed on those two, and there was a feeling that, oh, the state had given money to the city to fix up these kinds of conditions, and that money wasn't getting spent. And as best I can understand, that is not the city's responsibility, because that state bond issue went to the association. But I see we've got some folks here, so perhaps you guys know even more than me about this.
Mr. Chair, if I might interject, and I'll let the folks, I was going to say the ladies and gentlemen, come to the table, Mr. Vogel, introduce themselves, but I'd like to give you some additional background.
Hit me, please.
Also, but please.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm Betsy McKeown. I'm the Bureau Chief in Public Works, and we have, Jasmine, do you want to introduce?
Jasmine Wilding, the Stormwater Engineer.
Get closer to the mic, please.
Jasmine Wilding, the Stormwater Engineer that is managing the stream restoration grant.
And Rotorua Grants Administrator with the Department of Public Works.
And I'm Burr Vogel, Director of Public Works.
Thank you all very much for being here. Alderwoman Finlayson, you want to provide the background about the cemetery?
At least for the pictures. And first of all, I have family buried in Brewer Hill Cemetery and have been connected to the cemetery all my life. And when, Mr. Chair, you brought this to my attention, I immediately reached out to the leadership in the Brewer Hill organization, who happened to be in my church. And so the pictures that you see are from Sunday after church. I asked for a walkthrough. So we walked through the whole cemetery. You have to know that for several years, I've raised the issue with Anthony Brown. Now he's our Attorney General, but when he was in Congress and was on the Veterans Committee, the fact that there are veterans buried in the Brewer Hill Cemetery side of the cemetery, but whose graves are not maintained. And you can see one in this picture. The military cemetery headstones have that insignia at the top. And if we could go through a couple of other pictures, I want to show you the other, next. So you see the National Cemetery, which is, and you ladies are very familiar with this is for the public, and where the overgrowth is the Brewer Hill Cemetery side of the picture. Next picture, please. Next picture, please. And you can see the slope of the other cemetery coming down into Brewer Hill. And what you see starting from the building is the area that was repaired by Hyatt's company to stop whatever the runoff was, I guess, or whatever was not done when that development, and with no blame, I understand. But there are two different projects here, and one is, this is the last one. One is what Hyatt did, and I understand his work, his company's work is finished. Okay. And then where the city picks up in this, where the black, what do you call it? The
Silk fence.
Silk fence is where the city property, the cemetery ends, but it's all city property down the ravine that goes down behind.
So just a couple of clarifications.
Okay,
Yes, please jump in, because we're clearly a little muddled here, so thank you.
So Jasmine is the PM on this project, but from what I'm aware of, the Hyatt work still has an open bond. So they still need to do some work because we are not completely satisfied with the work that they did.
Can I just ask you, when you say an open bond, you mean as in a legislative bond issue from the state, or a city?
So the Hyatt project was across the street, and the drainage came to this drainage channel. And so as part of that construction project, they had to do this. And so we get construction bonds. And so I don't even think this bond has been reduced yet, which is usually done after we get as-built drawings of what was done. And the reason is because it's not completely tying into the slope. It's not stable there, if you notice when you go look at it. Mm-hmm. But and none of this is city property. So none of the drainage channel is city. This is all private property. And I think that's why we get some of this confusion about, some of the grants, I'll call them grants, are going to the cemetery directly, and this one happened to come through to the city. But yeah, it's all private property. The cemetery is a co-signatory on the city grant, and I've invited him to our next design meeting for this, just to try to help clear up, some of the goals that he might have too. But we started the stream, where we're calling it a step pool conveyance, just 5 months ago in May.
Could I ask you to just describe briefly what a step pool conveyance system is?
Sure. So I think it'll end up, we have a very early concept drawing of what we're doing in the stream channel, and it's like 200-ish feet, basically taking a 10 to 12-foot drop and dividing it over smaller drops, so to dissipate some of the energy. A lot of this work will be to fill in, so that will reduce risk to, disturbing graves. As part of the Hyatt work, there was a detailed grave survey, stuff done. So we're not starting from scratch.
Ms. Wilde, could we get the picture up will be better described what you're talking about? Can we go back a picture or two?
What does it look like?
I think that's it. Is that, if you can
So
look
that's
closest?
part of what the Hyatt pipe runs, I'll call it the Hyatt pipe, runs through there. And then now I think with the drawing that Atwell, the early drawing showing the step pools that we'd like to construct with the grant, we'll be able to negotiate out with Hyatt, what should be their portion of finishing the project. I think the plunge pool where they ended, the first pool of the step pool will probably be something they work on fixing up. The grant was for $100,000. We have $40,000 that we use for design. So any shortfall in the funding with the $60,000 we'll be using our watershed restoration fund, or we could pursue additional state grants if that was of construction grants if that was of interest. But I think one of the things I'd like to work out with the cemetery is whether or not a retaining wall is appropriate, because my understanding is that's what they're looking at their grant to do that. And I think there's some engineering risk there, and so that's what I think the city could maybe lend some eyes on that, just to make sure, is that actually worth the disturbance? Is that going to kind of influence what we're trying to achieve in the stream? And so I don't know any of the other committee members except for the one gentleman. So I think, if there was more and stakeholder involvement there, that could maybe be helpful. But
If I might, because I really need clarity, and people are watching because they knew this was going to be on our agenda today. The area that Mr. Hyatt has been working on, and that's the area that you're seeing in this picture, still has not finished the job. Is that what I'm hearing?
yes.
And so what's the timeline for the completion? And is there a connection between what was done, what he has done, and what we're supposed to be doing?
Yes, there is a connection, and it's next on Atwell's agenda to set up a meeting with Hyatt and us to sort of negotiate out what his job termination would look like. I think now that we have an early concept drawing with the survey work all complete, build upon what Atwell had already done previously, or Bay Engineering, we're at the stage now where we can negotiate that out with Hyatt. And yeah, the city has a ability to pool a bond if, we don't get the response that we need. But at this point, I don't have an indication that that is where we will need to go.
So tell me about the $100,000 that I thought was supposed to go to Brewer Hill Cemetery, the foundation or the board or their organization. Did that money come into the city, and where, and I've met with Mr. Brown as well as Mr.
Harris? Mr. Harris?
Harris, yes. I call him Tiny Tim. I was trying to think of his formal name.
He's very tall.
So the $100,000 grant that we have a grant agreement signed with the state, and it says step pool, conveyance, design, and construction. So it's very clear. There's a separate, I believe it's $70,000 that I forwarded to Burr, who I think forwarded it to you guys. I don't have the signed version because that's between the cemetery and the state directly. The city never touched the funds and is not involved. But that one is more general in its nature, and I'm assuming that is the one about landscaping and other items. And Mr. Harris, when I talked to him, said the state feels strongly that a retaining wall is needed and is pushing him that way to use that funding that way. But I don't know if there's more grants that he has been pursuing. I can't completely speak to that because I'm not purview to that information yet.
So just to put a point on this, I think what I'm hearing from you guys, what I'm hearing from you, Alderwoman Finlayson, is there are three different, let's call them funding sources, that are going into this cemetery. There's the Hyatt money, there is the state grant to the city for a stream restoration. And then there is a state legislative bond issue that is to the cemetery for maintenance. And my original concern was spurred about that legislative bond issue and it not getting spent down. But I understand from all of you that that is not really the city's problem.
Nothing to do with the city. You are
Yeah,
correct.
nothing to do with the city.
So did we get a bond or did we not?
We got a grant for stream restoration to the city.
So there was no $100,000 bond, but we got a $100,000 grant.
I think they're one and the same. It's a bond bill.
It's a state, right, a state, I think we call them state capital grants that come to us through the bond bill, or local bond initiatives is the legislative process that results in a grant to, in this case, the city.
So we did get that amount.
We got $100,000.
Okay, and that is what Ms. Wilder said. We've spent, what did you say, 40,000 already?
Yeah,
of it?
we've obligated 40,000 or encumbered 40,000.
Okay, and then the Brewer Hill organization has obviously pursued additional funding, and the retaining wall, and I assume the retaining wall is proposed to run where the fence is.
No, I don't think so, but I honestly don't know what his vision for that retaining wall is, but I am a little concerned about it.
We think it was to go along the stream bank and maybe to protect the cemetery from erosion. And our recommendation there, again, this is not necessarily something we control because it's their property, but our recommendation there would be to monitor the erosion to see if how quickly it's progressing, rather than spending a lot of money and going through a lot of disturbance to do something that may not be necessary. And so we should just be really watching that erosion to see if it's making that steep slope unstable. Well, especially once we complete our project, which will take a lot of energy out of that water flow.
So one of the questions that I had, if you could go back one picture, I'd like to see the National Cemetery. Because the runoff from that cemetery is what's causing the problem at Brewer Hill. And the question is anything being done to fix that problem?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's causing it. I think they are contributing drainage area to that same channel. And I think politically it could be beneficial to reach out to the Army Corps of Engineers to try to help fund the construction. I didn't get a response when I asked a gentleman they've been repairing the caretaker's lodge, so they had a grading permit come through for that. But yeah, I'd have to, look at like what percent of their drainage area, but it's a large drainage area, but they are one piece of it, yeah.
I guess I have a serious problem. Mr. Harris is 90 years old, and he's doing the best that he can with very limited professional, he's a professional person, but he's not an engineer that would know how to deal with any of this. And he has, because he's been doing it for years out of need. But I just have a serious problem. I don't know what the city's responsibility in this, and whether we're going to just throw up our hands and say, sorry, it's private property, we can't do anything. But we've allowed this to happen over years. When Severn Savings Bank was built, there was a problem, but it was allowed to be built as it was that caused additional damage to the cemetery. And now Mr. Hyatt is taking care of that, and I thought he was finished. I'll reach out to him to find out for sure. But I think we have a responsibility to help with this. Not say, well, it's up to them. It's up to Mr. Harris at 90 to take care of this.
So I think I'd like to follow up on that. That's exactly our involvement here, right? We are helping Mr. Harris out by managing this grant and performing this project so that we can eliminate or very significantly slow down the erosion. So there's no, I remember from our site walk, no immediate threat to the cemetery of
Are
any
you
of the
kidding?
grave
I was
sites.
there on Sunday in the rain. There is a continuing threat to the cemetery, to those gravestones that are underneath that growth. Yeah, there's
Sure,
continuing
but
damage.
I'm talking about from the stream channel erosion, right? And so the slope is not going to imminently fall off because we haven't managed the erosion problem. We're taking proactive steps here. I think it's going to be very beneficial. And the reason I moved from the backseat to here was to follow up on just one question you had asked earlier is, what is Mr. Hyatt going to do? They are done with their construction work. They are going to make a financial contribution to the construction project. As Jasmine mentioned, we spent $40,000 on design. That leaves us $60,000 left for construction. That won't be enough. So we'll be making a contribution out of the city's watershed restoration fund, as well as seeking reimbursement from Mr. Hyatt for a fair contribution to do the work that we think that was kind of incomplete.
I thought I heard her say that his work was not done.
He didn't complete the work to our total satisfaction. That's why he owes us a financial responsibility to contribute to the continuation of the project, but that project will be done by us, not him.
Okay, and so what's that amount?
We don't have an estimate.
No, you're going to just bill
Yeah,
it for whatever?
Yeah, I think we're at the stage now where we can meet and negotiate with him. I mean, I wasn't aware that we were definitely doing it. I think that could be a logical path forward. But I think negotiating with him, like this part is what you need to do to stabilize to the point where you were responsible, and then we take over from here. I mean, it probably does make sense for the same contractor to do all the work. And I don't have the amount of the bond off my head, but we have not been able to sit down with him yet. But I think that is the next step now that we have sort of an idea of what we want to do. There is one really large, I think it's an 84-inch tree on the bank. So that's kind of what we're working through with our forester right now with even our design. But I know like a retaining wall would definitely impact that. So that's just another natural resource to be sort of cognizant of that.
And I trust that we have or will be contracting with the woman who has the dogs that determine cadavers. The same lady that was used at Crownsville. I'm not sure what she's been through, because there are bodies, there are graves under this.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you said that we had already, or Mr. Hyatt had already done a grave survey.
There
So
was
you
one
have that
done,
data,
I'm
correct?
sure as part of the grading permit for when we actually go to construction. There might be some permits from like state wetlands, also historic trusts. So there will be safeguards for that type of thing, but I think also because we are mostly not excavating, we're mostly filling in, our impact should be none, but.
Fingers crossed on that.
And we're pretty far from the graves. We're like down in the
using similar access as the prior construction. So our footprint would not be too much bigger than the construction that's already occurred.
Well, there are markers along, one of the pictures shows the markers, but there are graves inside those markers. And you can see the headstones, in some cases, the remnants of the headstones that are there. So I think there needs to be some further investigation to make sure that the graves are not disturbed.
And we've coordinated with Mr. Harris on that issue.
Okay, then I'm sure Mr. Harris is listening and watching.
Good.
Yeah, so there'll be an opportunity to sit down and work through all of this so that the community does know what's going on, and we do.
Yeah.
I invite, like I said, I invited him to our next progress meeting, which is later this month, and he's welcome to bring along other committee members. But I think it'll be a good time to share with him where we've gotten, because we haven't met with him in a bit of time. So I understand he's in the hospital.
Would you
right now,
please
but,
share the time and date with me also? I
Sure,
may not
yeah.
make it, but I can share that information with others in his organization and in my church.
That would be helpful. Thank you. And thank you all so much for helping us get these things untangled today. I think it was just had a lot of moving parts, and I'm glad we were able to make sure everybody's straightened out. One last quick thing. I probably don't have to tell you that there's a lot of political mess around stream restoration in the state of Maryland, and particularly around tree removal. So it sounds like you guys are already thinking about that 84-inch tree, but just you don't want to be the next on the front page of the Bay Journal.
It's not in our path, but I think the calculation of how the root zone for a tree that large, the root zone does overlap, and so that's why we've only been working 5 months. We have a concept design, but that was the first thing that the Atwell engineer, can you have your forester look at this? And so I think that we're being very conservative in our damage assessment of that tree. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
I did recommend that our tree guy be invited out to look at the trees, especially in that swath of the cemetery.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I understand it was, in some ways, some of the concerns we had are not things that are your responsibility. So I even more appreciate you guys being here and making sure that we're able to fully provide oversight on all these things. So thank you.
Thank you.
Last thing on the agenda, I've got an update from our finance department.
Hello, Finance Director Jody Dickinson. Yeah, just a couple of things to mention. We're underway with trying to prepare the financial statements for June 30, 2024 to get ready for the audit. The auditors are planning to come out early November to start their review of the information. And this year we're going to use them to help actually pull the document together at the end of the audit process. So that should be a help for us. So we are well underway with that and trying to close everything out now. And then just to tell you that we still have a few vacancies that we're trying to fill. I have a cashier. We have the second budget analyst position we've been interviewing for. Cashier and senior accountant we're still trying to fill. And you may have seen, I don't know if you watched the emails come out about the positions. The finance director position was listed in the last couple days. So that's out there, and I'll give you a heads up that my assistant finance director has given her notice as well. You'll see that position open probably today or tomorrow. We'll get that listed. So we're going through some transition.
Who's in that position now?
Julie Donnelly. Yeah, she's accepted another opportunity. So we'll have her for a few more weeks. And then we'll have to say goodbye. We're really going to miss her there. She's been quite a help to us.
I feel like I hear so often from across many different departments, and I've been on the job 3 weeks, so feel free to tell me if this is just not a representative sample. But I feel like I've heard so often we have a position we're trying to fill. Would either you, Ms. Dickinson, or you, Ms. Buckland, hazard a guess at, is the issue how long it takes to fill a position? Is the issue that people are leaving too often? Where could you pinpoint why that it feels like we have so many open positions right now?
I think there are a couple of things. You actually see this in the Department of Finance a fair amount, and you can disagree with me if you want to, where we do try to be good about promoting from within and giving people paths, but what that ends up doing is sort of shifting the vacancy around so that I'm hiring for this one and now I'm hiring for that. And I know finance has been caught in that, which sort of makes that feel like you're always chasing a vacancy. I think the other thing too that you often see in local government is a certain amount of just cyclic cycles where I would expect to see, with the election cycle, seeing a little bit of turnover there, just because that's often when, other places they might be starting something new. They've had a change. And so the opportunities that are open to people tend to be somewhat cyclical. So you see the hiring cycle go that way. Obviously the city really focused on trying in the negotiation process this year, really tried to make sure that we were in a good, attractive place as an employer. And so, my hope is that some of that shows up in continuing. We do have the blessing of having a lot of staff who have been with us for a long time. I think sometimes what happens to us is that we hear about particular cases, but we don't always look at the broad, is that a representative sample, or is that we happen to hear about certain positions? I'm not aware of any particular driving factors that are causing an abnormal number of vacancies. Obviously, we've had a couple of vacancies that we hear about because, we had long-term staff that people knew well and liked and who had tragedies in their lives. They got sick. We've had a couple of staff who passed away. That brings those stories close to mind, because obviously then you're hiring for that position and not for reasons that anyone likes.
Well, it just kind of came to my mind hearing Ms. Dickinson's note about a lot of, or having some positions open. So I appreciate just commenting on it.
Yeah, I echo what Vicki has said. I think you'll find from an accounting, it's multifaceted in that, one, we're really busy, so that's a little bit frenetic. But two, it's very competitive market, especially in accounting and finance positions, and you will find vacancies in most accounting offices, including and especially government accounting. And we just don't have as many accounting graduates coming out of college and focusing on that as a career, especially those that are coming to this specialty, governmental accounting. So you'll see this everywhere with the accounting function. There's a little bit of, we're really busy. We've added positions. The council's been very generous in adding positions, and the budget analyst is a new position, so we're just trying to fill that. But when you interview, you have you have very few very highly qualified people that are coming after the position. So it's just, sometimes you have to go out to market 3-4 times before you find the person you want that says yes to your offer. So that's been what we're finding on the listing end of things. And then we do have some where we've moved a position, somebody moved over to fill an opening in purchasing, so now we have an opening on our cashier's desk to fill. And the cashier's is an entry-level job, so that's typically somebody we get from the outside. So it's just this multifaceted issue that it's been going on since I got here, and I think before I was here as well.
Sure. Well, oh yes, Alderman Finlayson.
I'd like to make a request of the finance director, not to put more work on your plate, but I think it would be very helpful. Let me preface it by saying our minutes do not reflect what is said. Our minutes are action minutes, so only action items are reflected. I think it would be very helpful if we had a short report on what you're saying. If you would give us, and with the ability to dictate into our computers these days, just a bullet, 5 items that you're reporting on, because you just gave us some important information. It may have gone in one ear and it may have gone out the other, but we have no record of it. And I think it would be helpful to be able to go back, and we could all sit here and take notes copiously, but it might not be exactly what you've said. But would that be too taxing to ask you to give us, when you give us your reports, to give us just the bulleted items? And I'm sure you can dictate it into your computer, because I've learned that skill recently, how to just talk and the computer types whatever you say. If we were smart enough, we could have done it while you were talking, but no. So anyway, could we do that, Ms. Dickinson?
Could I propose another way of doing this, is that on YouTube, because all our meetings are going up on YouTube, it is doing exactly what you described of dictating it. So it gets, if you look at the transcript of it, we have it all written out on there on YouTube.
I don't know about that, but I would like Ms. Dickinson, because she can do it because it's her language,
You speak a different language than the rest of us, sometimes in finance.
But when you dictate into things, it records. I don't want anything taxing. I just want something that we can refer back to.
So, yes, I can do it, too. It's easier just to do it informally during the meeting, and it will take a little bit of extra time to actually put something in writing, because I'll want to have some kind of format, and then I'll have to run it through my supervisors then. So, I mean, it's a little more time. It is a little more time. It's not a lot more time. And I pretty much tell you the same things every time I come here anyway, so.
Well, and that's fine, if that's what it is, but I just think like we should have, and I'll go to the YouTube and see if that's sufficient, but I just think we should have something for the record. In all of our records, it says you gave a report. And not just you, anybody else that comes before us, likewise, what is that report?
So I don't know if the finance director's report is a required item in the finance committee requirements per the code or not. That's why I've been doing it informally, because I don't know if it says the finance director shall give a report. And if,
Well, traditionally, we have gotten at least quarterly a financial update on the status of the city's budget. We haven't in recent years, but in the past, we had a full-blown update, at least quarterly.
So we still do quarterly budget versus actual reports, which we send to you via emails. As far as what you're talking about, as far as the previous quarterly update, I'm not sure what was in that report, so I can't comment to that.
Okay, well, I'm talking about before the committee, so it goes into our notes or into our minutes. And so maybe you could send those to Caitlin so we can make sure that it goes in our minutes. I'm not trying to, put more work on your plate, because but I just think we need some more information. We need some documentation, for lack of a better word, on what's been said in our meetings. Thank you.
Do I see a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned at 12:09 PM.
Okay, would you show me?